Yo, what's going on, Lorcana players? I'm Sue, but feel free to call me Pat, and this is the Ruby Amethyst control deck that I played yesterday at the 1K at Bearded Dragon in New Jersey. It went undefeated in Swiss. Granted, we split top cut because Swiss finished at around like 8 p.m., I want to say, and if we had actually played the tournament to its natural conclusion, some of us wouldn't have gotten home until 2 or 3 a.m. yesterday, so forgive me if I don't actually know how far I could have actually taken this. Still, I think going undefeated in Swiss is a pretty big accomplishment with the deck. And I want to talk about a number of the ratios and tech choices that went into this shell that I think make it really good in the mirror and have just a really strong matchup spread overall in the entire format. This is a project that I worked on with a good friend of mine, Thomas, aka Cloaked. If you're in the Lorcana Discord, you may know him as one of the moderators there. We have been trying to tweak and perfect this deck for probably close to 2 months at this point. Before players even had physical cards in their hand, once the whole set was shown, it became pretty apparent that red-purple was like the deck to beat. It looked good on paper, and after a couple of games on Tabletop Simulator, it felt incredibly strong. And most of the stuff that Thomas had come up with originally, like, Amber Steel with songs and things like that, Sapphire Steel ramp, Emerald base control shells. This deck just felt like it had legs versus everything, which, as you guys know, if you've been paying attention to competitive Lorcana, this is kind of the deck to beat. It's, again, pretty dominant. I think the cat's kind of been out of the bag for a while now. But again, I do want to talk about some of the tech choices that are in this list, as opposed to some other ones, because I played against 3 Ruby Amethysts in Swiss, and it was never close in those matchups, except for when I played, obviously, Thomas himself, which ended up being a draw. But even in casual games against other players, never close. Multiple mirror matches throughout the day where I won 20-0 or like 20-2. So it's, really well positioned in that case. Beat an Amber Emerald as well. That went to game 3, but the 2 games I won, again, never really close. And then even Amber Steel, which I played against as well in Swiss. The standard variation that I see most people play, again, not a close matchup. But there was one person I did want to give a shout out to, Alex, who I believe was my round 5 opponent. His version of Steel Amber was actually pretty impressive and had a number of tech choices that I don't see other players play. And that is why I think he was probably the hardest person I played against in Swiss. He was the closest person to actually beating my shell. So enough talking. Let's go into the actual deck list. I apologize in advance for lighting in the video. I will put the cards up on the screen using the official images of the cards, largely because product availability doesn't afford me the luxury. Certain cards are foil that I might not have non-foil copies of, and the weather's been pretty garbage here all weekend. It was for the tournament yesterday, and it's still garbage today, so again, lighting's not the best. So first up is 4 Archimedes here. This is the worst card in the deck, for sure. I am unsure, as time goes on, if this will be needed. We will see. Right now, it is only played because it gives us an advantage against Lilo or one-drop Maleficent base decks, basically aggro decks. It gives us a turn 1 play to contest them, and if they don't open Simba Bodyguard on 2, then obviously we just get to get in there for free damage. And in the mirror, sticking anybody is usually good and allows you to rack up some early lore and get ahead. And if they don't spend threats on these kinds of things, then you're going to end up coming out ahead overall. I still think it's the worst card in the deck. My best friend has basically been trying to explain to me that control decks really don't need something like this, but I'm unsure of what else I would play in the spot right now without massively impacting my Amber Steel matchup. It's a 2-2 vanilla, guys. There's not too much else to say about the card. Next up is 4 Magic Brooms here. So this card is a necessity. I see a lot of lists play 3. Nope, you gotta play 4, because if you don't play 4 copies of the card, you run the risk of decking out in the mirror, and you run the risk of decking out against a whole new world-based variants. So anybody who's on a whole new world, they might be playing 64 to 66 cards in their list, and they will try to deck you out if you don't have brooms. And a lot of people are being very greedy because I recognize Broom is not particularly strong in certain matchups and in a lot of situations. But by playing the 4th Broom, you could kind of keep the number of cards in the list low. I play 63, and that is because I can't afford to go down to just 60, because if you see certain combinations of hands against the mirror, you will deck before they do. But at the same time, against a whole new world, if you just get unlucky with how cards wheel out of your hand from a whole new world, you might also not be able to stabilize and not afford yourself the deck out. So it's really important to play Broom. I think having 4 Brooms allows you to hit that like lower number. You want to be as close to 60, like I said, as possible without, like going too much over it. Because if you go like 66 or 70, like I see some other control shells play, you don't have that consistency against things like Amber Emerald or Amber Steel, and you won't be able to find necessary pieces like Dragonfire when the time comes. So I think it's really important to keep the deck number low, still over 60, but as low as you can. And by playing not greedy and playing 4 whole copies of Broom, you can easily kind of get yourself there by obviously shuffling back in Dragonfires or other critical pieces that you might need. And most importantly, in the hyper late game, just shuffling other Brooms back in your deck. So each Broom represents another card in your deck. There was one of my round opponents where I was way ahead on lore, but he was just keeping the board clear, and it was going to very obviously go to deck out. And because I was playing the 4 full copies of Broom, I was able to keep putting Brooms back in my deck and eventually force him to kind of go all in and then have no threats left in his deck as a result. So yeah, Broom, really, really important card for a lot of matchups. For Maleficence, I don't think I really have to explain this one. It's a cantrip. For those of you who are new to card games, who don't play anything other than Lorcana, a cantrip is any card that when you play it, it replaces itself. So, Maleficent here, 3 costs, you play her, she draws a card. So she is a 2/2 for 3 that cantrips 1, right? And then obviously her being a 3 cost means that she can sing Friends on the Other Side, which is one of the best cards in the entire game. Again, I don't think I have to explain too much on why Maleficent's in the deck. 4 of Aladdin Street Rat. This card plays way better than it reads. I see a lot of lists not playing this, but it's really, really strong. So it's a 2/2 for 3, which is basically Archimedes' stat line. Not particularly great. But when you play it, your opponent loses 1 lore. And this is super good because this is what lets you stabilize versus aggro. And it's incredibly scary for certain decks that don't play hard removal. What I mean by hard removal, for those of you who are new to card games and Lorcana is your first, hard removal is something like Dragonfire that banishes something, or like Fire the Cannons or Smash that can deal more damage to the character than it has health. So if you do not have a way to get rid of Aladdin, if I just play it, make you lose a lore so that way you're not quite where you need to be, you're not gaining as much lore as you should at that point, and I leave it standing to shift it later into Heroic Outlaw, that's incredibly scary. I don't have to quest with this card and put it at risk. I can just leave it sitting there against something like Amber Emerald, and depending on what they actually quest with, I might be able to shift this later in the game into Heroic Outlaw and swing the game entirely in my favor as a result. So again, the card reads a lot better, largely because Heroic Outlaw exists. You do have that explosive shift play later on in the game. But even then, like in the late game in the mirror, dropping 1 or 2 Street Rats super late game not only threatens Heroic Outlaw, but it swings the lore back around, and that's what allows you to stabilize and pull out a lot of games. I can't imagine not playing the shell without this character, having switched to him a couple weeks back. Controversial take to Rafiki's. It's only really good versus the decks that play Simba Bodyguard. And I think it's not particularly great versus anything else. That's my hot take. I don't like the fact that it is uninkable. It is really strong card. I'm not going to say it's not. But in the mirror, which at the moment, metagaming is real, by the way, guys. Like if you look at the decks online, right? Half the stuff you see in Top Cut is Ruby Amethyst. So if I play 4 of this card's just dead. I can't ink it. And it's pretty subpar as far as questing goes. And in the mirror, there's a ton of removal. So I still want it for the matchups that I want for it for. If I know I'm playing against some kind of Amber variant, I'm going to aggressively mulligan for this card. But this card on 3 is clutch. And then after turn 3, it's kind of whatever, right? So again, very strong card because it comes down, rushes, and gets in there, knocks out a bodyguard, and then whatever else you have on board, say Archimedes, can then trade with their Leela. So that's a really strong play. But overall, I think Rafiki is just good. I see a lot of lists, messing up their consistency and having very bricked hands as a result. I think 2 has been the perfect number for Rafiki. If Amber becomes a more prevalent color, or like Emerald based decks, like Emerald Steel, perhaps we could talk about going back to 3 Rafikis. But for me personally, 2 has been the right number when playing this deck. 2 Mickey Mouse, Wayward Sorcerer. This is because the deck needs a number of 4-cost plays. Going underneath Dragonfire in the mirror and having a strong, impactful turn 4 play is very, very good. He's also a sizable body that can contest a lot of things, like Hans in Emerald, for example, or even Hans in Steel, for that matter. So having a turn 4 body that can contest their potential turn 4 play is very, very good. Obviously, it has great synergy with the brooms as well, magic brooms, because it makes their cost useless, one less, not useless. It makes them anything but useless. It allows you to actually trade very efficiently into their stuff, because you could essentially challenge all of your brooms into their stuff, get them back to hand, and either ink them or replay them to shuffle back key cards such as Be Prepared or Dragonfire. I originally was at 3, but I moved him because I really wanted that consistency. But I moved him down to 2 in order to fit in a couple of other things that were not in my deck, specifically a certain one, which we'll talk about at the end of the game. Or I should say end of the deck profile. So there you go. That is what we played 2 Mickey Mouse. So a lot of people are already well aware of this. I noticed that, I think it was Podcana, the competitive podcast, one of their members mentioned Pongo. But yeah, I've been on Pongo for a while because Pongo is a 4-cost 2/3 evasive that quests for 2 lore, and it demands a response. And most decks don't play evasives, right? So if you play Pongo and quest it in the mirror, Rafiki doesn't touch it, Maui doesn't touch it, Aladdin can't challenge it. That's pretty much it. It's just, do you have Dragonfire? Do you have Be Prepared? Do you have Maleficent? Because if you don't, old Rascal here just quests for 2 all day. And it feels great because he only costs 4. So Dragonfire costs 5, so they spent 1 more ink than you did on Pongo to get rid of it. Maleficent is like, imagine spending 9 ink to get rid of a 4-cost 2/3 that quests for 2. That doesn't feel super good. So left unchecked, Pongo is pretty much the mirror breaker. He is the card that actually wins you the game versus the mirror. This is like the thing that, again, only Podcana, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, guys. If you guys do stumble across my video, let me know. You guys are the only ones I know that actually are aware of the Pongo tech, besides me and Thomas. But that said, I'm not done yet. I'm playing 3 copies of Goofy Daredevil because, again, he's a 3/4 evasive that, again, demands a response from Dragonfire or Maleficent or Be Prepared. And in the mirror, they're going to play like Maui on 5, and you're going to go, cool, here's a Goofy. Can't interact with it. If your opponent is on just the Pongo package, they're on 2/3 evasives. Here's a 3/4 evasive that challenges it and lives. So that's pretty good. It's very, very strong to have both of these. Yes, Pongo's more efficient, but if I know that you're on Ruby Amethyst and you are playing just Pongo and not Goofy, because Goofy is less efficient in terms of ink cost, and he trades evenly with Dragonfire. I spend 5 for Goofy, you spend 5 for Dragonfire. On paper, Pongo is correct. But Goofy, because he also is another evasive threat that trades into Pongo, it's, again, metagaming, right? Everyone might go to Pongo in the future because it's what lets you win the mirror. But if I have Pongo and Goofy, I have the answer for your answer, which is why we play this. On top of that, I see, I should take this time, I should say, Mickey, BLT. Not a fan of that card, because yes, even though that is an evasive threat, you spent 8 for it, and at that point, the only deck that really cares about going past 8 ink is the Mirror, and it's filled with 4 copies of Maleficents, 4 Dragonfires, 4 Be Prepareds. So, and those all trade reasonably favorably, right? Dragonfire is cheaper, Be Prepared is cheaper in terms of ink cost. Maleficent is more in terms of ink cost, but you get the 7/5 quest for 2 body that's left behind, which makes it, you come out ahead in that case, in that instance. So I think anybody who's playing Mickey, I encourage you to try Goofy or Pongo. You'll find more often, rather than just playing Mickey BLT and passing your turn, you'll probably have a lot of scenarios where you can go Dragonfire, Pongo, go, and get similar or better value out of that line of play. So that's our evasive package. And again, I think I saw maybe like one person play Pongo the whole tournament, but otherwise there's just Thomas and me, and it just made the mirror match a complete stomp because we're playing a full evasive package and our opponents just aren't. So their Mauis are dead, our Mauis are live. It's really, really good. Speaking of Maui, here he is, Dwayne Johnson himself. Maui, hero to all. I'm pretty down on this card actually right now. Originally, I read this card and I was like, it's a 6/5 with Rush, right? Rush Reckless that can't quest. So I just envisioned him originally as like, I don't know, like a Lava Axe. Lava Axe is not quite the right way to say it because that's Go's face, but like it's a 5 mana, 6 damage spell for the most part. For those of you who come from Magic, you're paying 5 to deal 6 to any follower that's on your opponent's board, which reads really good. But the cat's been out of the bag on Maui for a while now. People are well aware of him. And I think if you're not going to play like the 3-cost Elsa that can tap things like my original engine to force the issue, then he's going to not be as good. And if the mirror starts to move towards evasives with like potentially even Tigger going forward, then Maui again loses a lot of value. But I still think you have to play at least 2 in the list. I might cut this guy from 3 to 2 because Cusco is a very real thing. I think Cusco is probably the best follower in the game right now because he cannot really be interacted with. He, 1-for-1s at worst. He might even 2-for-1. And he almost always gets his 3 lore. He's probably, again, the best follower in the game because he's just very difficult for any deck to interact with outside of Ruby. And Ruby's only real good responses are Maui, which is a break even. And even then your opponent got 3 lore, or Be Prepared, which you come out behind by spending 2 more ink than your opponent. And you might end up spending more cards than they do. Like if you have like 2 followers on the board and they just have Cusco and nothing else, you might have to spend 7 ink and trade your whole board for Cusco to not lose that game depending on the lore totals between both players. So Maui still has a place, is what I'm saying, because Cusco exists, and I think it is the strongest follower in set 1. But again, as we start to get better and more familiar with the card pool, and I think as this deck, Ruby Amethyst, evolves, I think his role starts to become more and more diminished. 2 Queens. Originally, this was my favorite card in the deck, largely to torture my poor mother because she hates this character with a passion. But as time went on, I realized I kept inking a lot of them. I didn't really need all of them. And even then, once I started to recognize the power of Magic Mirror, I started to doubt Queen's role, right? Is Queen really that good? Maybe we don't play that. And talking to players yesterday at the 1K, I noticed a lot of them had similar sentiments. Most people were down to 1 Queen or no queens in their list, and they weren't really feeling it. The thing about Queen is that she dominates the steal matchups in the late game because they're all playing Beast as a tech choice to destroy Mirror. But they might not have a straight out to Queen because most of their low drops don't trade particularly well. They have to 2-for-1 themselves to get rid of Queen. And if you could just Dragonfire to keep them off of the higher drops that can trade favorably with Queen, then that's really good. This, of course, all is assuming you don't have shield, because then if you have queen plus shield and mirror, it's incredibly taxing on the steel player. And unless they can like Hades loop beasts repeatedly to stop it, you're just going to out card advantage them. And a lot of players I feel like are moving towards us. Certainly the man Alex I played against who had the really strong variant, a more hand taxing version of Ambered Steel. I think as that version gains more prominence, once people are more aware of its game plan and what it can do and how it can really control the hand and the pace of the game versus this deck, Queen becomes more of a necessity. In fact, I'd argue I'd rather play 3 Queens and 2 Mauis currently than the other way around. So going forward, I think I'm going to go back up to a 3rd copy of Queen because, again, she really dominates these steel matchups that are, trying to be teched out to beat this deck, because, again, Ruby Amethyst is the deck to beat. Next up, for Aladdin, Heroic Outlaw. I could see this being a 3 of if you're not a super big fan of it. This is obviously the boogeyman. You just have it at 4 to increase its consistency of being able to shift off of Street Rat. It's just really strong power play. Obviously, 5/5 for 7 is not the greatest stat line, but it still gets you the 2 lore. It is a decent threat in the late game, even if your opponent has nothing on board. It's still questing for 2. Obviously, its best use is against the Emerald decks or any of the aggressive strategies. If you could shift into this on 5, it really swings the game in your favor because now you have a big beater. They have to respect it. They have to deal with it because they're just not going to be able to get lore if they leave this guy on the board. In the mirror, he's largely irrelevant unless you find a specific card that I notice a lot of people play many copies of, but I only play 1 of because I find in the mirror, when played well by a good pilot, you'll see almost every single card in your deck. So I don't feel the need to have more than 1 copy of that card, being Pocket Watch, and we'll talk more about that when we get to actually Pocket Watch. 2 Ursulas. So originally this was the 7 cost Dr. Facilier, and I think Dr. Facilier is a better card than Ursula in any matchup but the mirror. So that's why Ursula is the call here, because Ursula not only quests for 3, but draws us a card, assuming that our opponent isn't at 0 lore. This is really important, by the way. If you jam Ursula and your opponent has 0 lore, you do not draw a card because they don't have a lore to give you, so therefore you do not draw a card. So it does cantrip, much like Maleficent, assuming your opponent has some form of lore. So that's really, really important, right? But it also has 8 willpower, which means that it doesn't die to Maui. So it's sticky versus the mirror because you're essentially playing a card to get a card, and your opponent has to spend a card. So you come out ahead on the exchange, right? So you spend 1 card and go -1 card for your hand. You draw from Ursula, so now you gained a card. So you're at net 0. We call that +0 in card game terminology. And then your opponent spends Dragonfire, but they don't draw a card off Dragonfire. So they spent a card to get rid of your Ursula. So they went -1, which is why it's particularly good. But if you're in a meta where Dragonfire is not like the most commonly played action, then Dr. Facilier ends up dominating the game because he has 3 quest power just like Ursula here. But he allows you to grind your opponent out with a ton of value by making a bunch of profitable trades or must-answer threats that come back to your hand, and thus you will bury your opponent in card advantage. I think going into set 2, if I decide to still stick with Amethyst, I don't know, we'll see what the control shells look like in set 2, then I think Dr. Facilier has a place because I do think he's a really strong and underplayed card. It's not the right meta call, in my opinion, over Ursula. Ursula just is a little bit stickier, a little bit more resilient, which is why I think she gets the nod. This one's going to probably be somewhat controversial to people. Only 3 copies here of Elsa, Spirit of Winter. This is probably my favorite card in the whole deck. I don't think you need the full playset of 4, though. I really don't, because there's a lot of games where you have 2 Elsas in your hand as early as like turn 4 or turn 5, and it just rots in your hand. And Elsa's like a serious power play that only becomes live on turn 8, maybe even turn 9. Like turn 9 is when like Elsa really hits her stride. And at that point, you probably have 2 sitting in your hand, right? Like why do I care if I have 4 in the deck? Because it's the hyper late game is where she's really strong, right? She's what puts the game away in the hyper late game. Surely you'll see one of them by the time we get to turn 9, maybe even turn 10. And even then, again, if you're playing the evasives package, right, you should be really far ahead if your opponent is not playing it. So Elsa slams the door as opposed to some other variants where I started to notice Elsa was what gets the game started. You'll notice that I had even like Mickey at 2 of when a lot of people have him as a 1 of in the deck. It's because, again, I'm trying to get the game started. Like, I'm trying to play lower to the ground than other control shells without compromising what makes the late game strong of the actual deck. I want to be ahead in the mirror early and force them to feel like they're pressured. Like, I want them to feel like their game is in my favor, that I'm dictating the pace of the match. And again, you have Broom at 4 in the deck, whereas some other players have Broom at 3 in the deck. Broom is inkable. It's playable early if you need a body, right? And just think of it this way. When you draw that Broom, it can just shuffle back another Elsa, and you'll probably find it sooner rather than later, because in the hyper late game, you're probably only got like maybe 10, 15 cards in your deck. So you have a pretty good chance of finding it. So I don't really see the need to play 4 copies of Spirit of Winter. This, by the way, again, this is my favorite card in the deck. I think the artwork is gorgeous on this, and I think having a crippling chill effect on a body is pretty good. And also, just in general, is I think one of the coolest Disney characters. So kudos to Ravensburger for making the girl actually really, really good. 4 copies of Maleficent Monstrous Dragon. As somebody who has done design work on cards in the past, I don't know why this card is inkable. So for those of you who come from Magic, you might understand this a bit better. But this is a modal DFC. This is a land that is also a late game bomb that with removal stapled to it. I think of all of the cards in the game that are inkable, I think Monstrous Dragon is the one where I'm like, why was this the one that was able to be inked? Because the opportunity cost of Monstrous Dragon is simply too low for what it is. Going forward in Lorcana's game life, maybe set 4, set 5, like thinking to the future. Let's say I'm on a red aggro list, right? Like a red ruby aggro, right? Maybe that's the color. What's to stop me from just jamming 4 Monstrous Dragons into my deck? It's just an ink in the aggro matchups. But let's say like I'm in the mirror and neither can get a foothold. If the game goes late enough, this card just becomes super live and is insane, right? So I just don't know if I agree with this card being inkable. Otherwise, it's just a house. It's Dragonfire on a body. On a body, for those of you, again, who are new to card games, is essentially, it is another card that you already have stapled to a follower. So Maleficent does the effect of Dragonfire, but after you play it, you still get a 7/5 dragon that's left behind that quests for 2. Obviously, very good at keeping tempo with your opponent in the mirror. You drop Maleficent and, get rid of their Maleficent. They play Maleficent, get rid of your Maleficent. You play a Maleficent, get rid of their Maleficent. So on and so forth. And you commonly are shuffling it back. In the mirror, ink only 1 maybe. But try to hold these as much as possible, because in the mirror, I find that the person who has more dragons is usually the person that's winning that game. So, not too much else to say. It's a really strong card. Now let's talk about item choices. 1, Shield of Virtue. I might go to 2 of this in the future. In certain matchups, like Steel, having Shield of Virtue to untap Queen is very, very important. Because we only have 2 copies of Queen, I didn't see the value in having more than 1 shield. But if I were to go to 3 Queens, I would go to 2 shields. I could see myself potentially going 3 shields if I go 4 Queens in the future, but I doubt it. Having shield in your deck, even as a 1-of, is really, really important, because you only need 1, realistically, in the mirror, in my opinion. I think that having more than 1 doesn't really do too much for you unless you have, like, Archimedes and like Street Rat Aladdin. You just go quest for 2 and then spend 6 to shield. But I feel like it's more beneficial to spend your ink on Magic Mirror, which is the card we'll talk about next, because In the mirror, card economy, like card like value, how much card advantage you have is what wins you the game. It's not necessarily about what cards are in your hand. It's about the number of cards in your hand. If I have 8 cards in my hand to your 2, and the 2 cards in your hand are like double Elsa, and the 8 cards in my hand are like all 3 costs and less, I'm like maybe 1 Dragonfire. Sure. Then I think I'm ahead because you can play Elsa, right? But like I can drop like 5 followers on the board. And Elsa can only really do with 2 of them. Or if you have like 2 Maleficents, you can only really deal with 1 of my things, and I have like 4 other things you have to worry about, right? So it is the amount of cards that you actually have in your hand. So I feel like having too many shields, it just results in it being a dead draw. But you still want it because it untaps Queen, because it untaps Heroic Outlaw if your opponent misplays. That's really important. I noticed a lot of people at the tournament were not aware that if they left themselves open, I could run into them with Heroic Outlaw, I could shield, restand, and then get it. And that's a huge swing. That is an 8 lore swing, and that just completely takes them out of the game. So you definitely want shield. It's just, I don't think I would play more than 2. I definitely think of all the cards that we talked about, this is the one that I want to go up on the most. I had played 1, and it felt fantastic. But I think having 2 for the really competent players and some of the bad matchups, it's definitely worth the consideration. 2 magic mirrors. So this is the mirror breaker, so to speak. Mirror is the mirror breaker. Not only is evasive the thing that will help you get the edge in the mirror, but again, player skill almost feels like it doesn't matter. And when it's 2 competent pilots playing, the person who gets mirror down first is pretty much winning that game. And in the mirror, the only option you have against Magic Mirror is Befuddle to kind of slow down their tempo, but that is a card disadvantage for you. So it might not even be worth it based on where you are in the game. Like turn 2, turn 3, sure, befuddling a mirror back to the hand will slow them down and will set them back the whole turn. So that is potentially worth it. But like turn 7, turn 8, nah, befuddling mirror doesn't matter. So in that case, I think having 2 mirrors is what puts you over the edge. So the first person, I feel like they could stick 1 and find the second one as advantage. In the future, it might be worth it to go to 3 mirrors. I never think it might be worth it to go to 4 because, again, you'll see almost your entire deck throughout the course of a game. So I just don't see the value in playing 4 because you'll never be able to cash in all 4 mirrors in a course of a game. It's really, really bad. Like think about it. When are you ever spending 16 ink to draw 4? That's what I'm trying to say here. That'll never happen. You'll never be in a spot where you're going to spend 12 ink to draw 3 either, which is why a third one feels terrible. But it might be worth the consideration to play a third just because if Ruby Amethyst keeps getting more and more popular, this is the card that you have to see on turn 2. In most of my games in the mirror, if I know my opponent is on Ruby Amethyst, I am going to pitch my whole hand except for Maleficent Sorceress and friends on the other side to try to find one of the 2 mirrors because it's that important. If Beast becomes more relevant as well, it might be worth it to play the third magic mirror. But at that point, I think just playing another shield with another queen is probably a bit better. Again, really important card. I just don't see the reason why I would play more than 2. I'll take this time, by the way, to show you the last item I have in the deck, which is a 1-of Pocket Watch. So we already talked a little bit about Pocket Watch with Heroic Outlaw earlier. One thing I want to say before I jump into talking about Pocket Watch, I don't play Ursula's Cauldron, and that is because the card, while I think it's a great card, offers card selection as opposed to card advantage. Card selection means that you get to just, look at 2 cards, and that helps shape your draws a bit better for the next draw that you actually take. Whereas Magic Mirror here is card advantage because you basically just keep getting to pay ink to draw a card. And having 6, 8, 10 cards in your hand is really, really backbreaking. It's very, very strong, right? That's what sets you apart in the mirror. So if your opponent has a bunch of cauldrons and you have a bunch of mirrors, they might have better cards in their hand, right? They might have their Elsas, their Maleficents, their Be Prepareds, right? In their hand, and you might just have the lower end chaff like Archimedes or Pongo, or maybe you just have a Dragonfire or some Aladdin Street Rats, no big threats, like nothing over 7 ink, right? But if you have like 8 cards to their like 2 or 3, they could play Maleficent, right? And just get rid of one of your followers. But like if you just deploy like 3 more after the fact, it's almost like it doesn't matter, because then it's like they feel pressured to, like they're behind at that point. Right? So having more cards in your hand is better than letting you actually just kind of sculpt the draws. And I just don't see a reason, because Ursula's Cauldron is uninkable. I don't see the opportunity cost as being worth it in that deck. That is my personal preference. Again, through my testing, I found that the sheer number of cards in your hand is what wins you the mirror. So I would, me personally, play more mirrors before I played another Cauldron. I had mirror matches at the tournament where my opponents knew the contents of their entire deck through Cauldron, right? And it didn't matter because they only had like 3 cards in hand to my like 8 or 9 or something like that. Like they were just so far behind in the war for resources. Ursula's Cauldron could say, exert it, search your deck for a card and put it on top. Like shuffle and put it on top, right? Like it could be like a vampiric tutor from Magic, for those of you who know what that is. And if you're behind by 5 or 6 cards, it's not gonna matter, right? It is a resource war game. So I just don't see the reason to put a card in my deck that doesn't advance my resource position or my board state to make me win the game. So that's why I chose not to play it. Back to the pocket watch at hand though. It is a one of for the mirror. I don't think it's particularly amazing in a lot of matchups. I think it's insanely good in the mirror, but I think you don't need multiples. I think multiples are just dead draws at that point. And having the singleton, when deployed stealthily, is incredibly potent. So for example, if we're in the late game and you see I have a clear board, right? You might quest with, I don't know, say a 3/3, like a Rafiki, right? And that's the only thing on the board is like Rafiki, and maybe you have something else, right? I don't have Pocket Watch on the board, and I have no followers, so you have no idea what's coming. So I could go Heroic Outlaw, right? And then that's 7, and then I could go 3, and then 1, and then go Pocket Watch, give it Rush, and then like hit 1. And if it's the hyper late game and I have Shield, then I can, untap it and go for a second one. Having Watch is really important in the mirror, but again, I don't want it to be a dead draw. And in the mirror, when you are jockeying for position, when both players are roughly equal, I find that games drag on incredibly long, very close to deck out to like the 15th or possibly even 16th turn. And by that point, you will find your 1 Pocket Watch, which is why I think it's worth it as a one-of, because having 2 or 3 massively impacts your matchup spread against any Amber X deck, any Amber Emerald, like Emerald Steel, like things like that. So I don't see the value in running multiple copies of it. So that's why I'm only playing 1. And in the matchups where it's super dead, like if I'm playing against aggro, I don't really think I need this that badly. I can just ink it. It's fine. All right, let's talk about actions. Befuddle. Just universally, decent action in the early game. Its main purpose is to balance Simba Bodyguard, but not every matchup is going to be that. So therefore, we don't need to max out on Befuddle. My philosophy for how I build decks is 4-ofs are things that I need to see to win the game, or just generically good, or the opportunity cost is incredibly low, like with Maleficent, Monstrous Dragon. So that's why I only play 3. Do note, in the mirror, it can bounce items. So if your opponent goes like turn 2, mirror, and you have no other play, you can potentially befuddle them. That will set them behind a turn at some point later on in the game if they want to deploy that. So that is an option for you. Just be aware it is card disadvantage, because you're essentially giving them back a card and you are losing a card. Depending on your board state, that might be worth it. Depending on your hand, like if you have Maleficent on turn 3 and you have Friends on the other side in your hand, sure, might be worth it. But again, its primary thing is to bounce specific things in the aggro matchup. Do note that it can bounce your stuff as well. So you can actually use it to bounce brooms in order to shuffle things back into your deck, such as more befuddles or more brooms. So that is the thing that you can do. Next up is probably the best action in the game, or very, very close to it. Friends on the other side. It's a divination in Magic, but it has the upside of being free if you sing it. Singing this is the real deal, but it is just straight card advantage. Again, card advantage wins the mirror. Drawing 2 cards is always a good thing to see on any card in any game, unless it's just horrendously overcosted. And 3, in Magic is not usually playable outside of like drafting or like sealed. But in this game, it's surprisingly pretty good. Remember who you are, I believe, is the Mind Rot in Amber. That card would be unplayable in Magic, but in this game, surprisingly pretty good. Again, this one being able to be free is pretty nuts. So yeah, really, really good card. Not too much else to say with that. 4 Dragonfire, you already know. It's a Doomblade, it's a kill spell, whatever you'll call it. It banishes a chosen character when you play it. It is the best unconditional removal card in the game. Removal is one of the strongest things. It's pretty much a necessity, I feel like, for any competitive deck in any game, unless you are just a glass cannon aggro deck that's just trying to win really, really fast, such as with Amber and Emerald. And then last card in the deck is my favorite Disney song of all time, Be Prepared. Yeah, probably the best card in the game. If it's not Friends on the Other Side or Cusco, it's this guy. Like this card, this was the reason why I built the deck in the first place, which is why I wanted to talk about it last. The main card that you associate with the control deck is what we call a sweeper, a Wrath of God. Terminus in Legacy Miracles from back in the day. Supreme Verdict, Wrath of God. Like all of these things are the staple things, the glue that holds the strategy together. That's Be Prepared. It's the best sweeper in the game. It is the only unconditional sweeper in the game, and it's the main reason to play the deck, I feel like. And you gotta play 4. The card, you need to see it. It's the thing that stabilizes the game. It might feel clunky. I've seen lists at 3, but I promise you, when you start to get really familiar with the deck and you start to, try and grind it out with these really good players, the 4th one matters. Being able to recycle it with Brew matters. The fact that it's a song also is just ludicrous, by the way, because you can play like, Ursula, recoup the card, and then pressure your opponent to feel like they have to add more to the board to stay ahead. And then you can just go, okay, my turn. I sing Be Prepared with Ursula. Blow up your board. I'll deploy the other Ursula, or like I'll deploy my Aladdin now so that I am ahead, right? Like I spent my turn singing a card to spend no ink on it, right? Nothing. I spent nothing on it. And then I get to rebuild first. That's unreal. Usually the drawback to a sweeper in a game like Wrath or Supreme Verdict is I spend my whole turn to wipe your board, and that'll stabilize the game, and hopefully you don't have any resources. But if you do, you get to rebuild first. That the opponent gets to rebuild first. That's what makes sweepers like kind of fair. That's kind of the give and take, right? Is if my opponent still has gas in the tank, well, they get to rebuild first, and now I'm once again on the back foot. They have to withstand all of my sweepers, and when they finally run out of gas, that's when I get to win as a control player. But Be Prepared allows you to just sing it and then rebuild first, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That is the entire Ruby Amethyst shell that I played. Again, it was undefeated in Swiss at the 1K at Bearded Dragon in New Jersey. Again, shout outs to Thomas for all of his help with this list. If there's any questions, anything I can do at all to help you, if you're a new card game player, new Lorcana player specifically, I will link my Discord down in this video's description. I am primarily a content creator for mobile games now. I don't really do too much card game content unless I think that it would be super beneficial and provide a lot of insight to the community, which is why I did this deck list. If you have any questions, again, my Discord, find it. Just DM me any of your questions. I will be more than happy to answer anything, help you out with anything you want. If you're new to card games, you want to learn the basics, get good at it, I don't mind helping you out. Again, just reach out to me. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day. Bye-bye now.